No. Okay. No further questions though? Okay. I think this course is in relatively good shape as far as that sort of thing goes. Yeah, so I'm just going to get in on it. So this week we are talking about marriage. Specifically, last week we talked about the other stuff kind of adjacent to marriage. Now what we're waiting for here is for me to get my computer where I want it to be. Okay, and now I'm going to share the screen with you. And then shift a few minor things around. One second, guys. Okay, there we are. Okay. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you see the first slide of the presentation? You guys can't see it? You do not? Okay, very good. Okay, 1 second then. See, there we go again. Okay, well.
There it is.
I got it, yeah. We're in good shape now. Okay, so here we go with our presentation on marriage, the institution itself. Like I said, this does tie in with last week's material, but it is, there's stuff outside of kinship that is related to marriage. There we are. So our general subheaders for this week are marriage and mates. Sorry, we're having a little bit of waiting room problems. There we are. Our general subheaders are marriage and mates. Then we will address general traditional marriage structures, problems in families, and then family structures. Everyone please mute. It creates some wicked feedback. Okay. This week, in terms of potentially, unpleasant content, we are going to be talking about romantic relationships, domestic abuse, structural sexism, anti-LGBTQ politics, incest, and divorce. So that is the unpleasantries we're going to talk about if you're the kind of person that, needs a little bit of heads up. So marriage and mates itself. While marriage is present in most societies, there is significant variation from one society to another. So what exactly marriage looks like really varies from one society to another. But marriage or something like it is present in almost every human society. So when we talk about marriage, we are talking about the customs, rules, and obligations that establish a socially endorsed relationship between adults, as well as between the kin groups of married partners. So it's the entire thing that the marriage encapsulates. So we are talking here about a social structure or a social institution itself. One of the major elements that is not discussed by most societies, but is also incorporated into the marriage thing in most societies, are incest taboos. I believe I mentioned this at least for a second last class, but one of the things ingrained in with marriage is that you don't marry your relative, right? Which sounds intensely gross to us, and it is. Incest then is defined as sexual contact between family members. Now, on this note, where you see difference from one society to another is what is considered incest or what is considered related to. That actually, we do see some variation from one society to another. Basically, and what this is tied with is, and how this can vary, is that when siblings reproduce, right, they create, those children are usually very, very sick. Because, and especially if that is allowed to continue and becomes a common thing within that society, children who are inbred one generation don't usually tend to have problems. But if it's 2 or 3 or even 4 generations, then very, very severe genetic conditions can develop. And we have seen in some spots in history, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, we saw that in the Spanish House of Habsburg among the royalty. Now, how it varies from one society to another as to whether it is or is not incest is where cousins come involved. Now, genetically, and I know this is so gross, and I have something coming in right now. Genetically, where it doesn't start making as much difference is that you could hypothetically reproduce with your cousin, your first cousin, and have children who probably would be okay health-wise. And then it becomes murkier between second cousins when second cousins reproduce. Actually, in those parts of the country where there are laws against that make you, and this is real, if you've never been married, you might not know this. Some parts of the country, Pennsylvania included, where I got married, you have to prove that you're not cousins with the person that you are getting married to. But that peters off, that stops at second cousins, right? It just keeps first cousins from getting married. And traditionally, historically, some societies haven't had any problem with second cousins getting married. Like I said, that is where the murkiness sets in, which sounds super gross to you, like me, when you do know your second cousins. And it sounds like, well, that's about the same thing. It's a different beast. But as I mentioned, though, it's kind of an unspoken thing with the institution of marriage that you don't marry people you're related to. Now, monogamy, and you'll see in this, these first beginnings of the lecture, these are just terms you need to know. Monogamy is the practice of having one spouse at a time or one partner at a time. I just put the word spouse in there for the sake of giving you a brief definition. Monogamy is typically expected to be lifelong and is the only legally recognized form of marriage in the United States. If you have more than one person that you're married for and you try to file it under the IRS, which is actually the only place that legally it makes a lot of difference as to whether you're married in the United States, you could get charged with the crime of bigamy, which is having more than one spouse at a time. It is, as I mentioned there, traditionally enforced through the tax code. The tax code, however, does not require a lifelong marriage. Every single year, hypothetically, you could file a different spouse. And as long as your paperwork checks out, you're legally totally fine. How that would happen, I'm not sure, but that's how it would happen. Additionally, monogamy is the most common form of marriage globally. There are many societies that do have different forms of polygamy or having multiple spouses, but having one spouse is the most common way of marriage globally. There's the incest taboos things again. Anything new to add here? No, this is just a duplicate of the original slide. Sorry about that. Oh, wait. Oh, no, I just went up. Okay. Anyway, the nuclear family. The nuclear family is a monogamous relationship between two adults who are the parents of children. If you are familiar with American history, particularly the history of the 20th century, you may remember this term nuclear family a little bit better because that was during the high part of the nuclear era, if that makes any difference for you. But effectively, that word nuclear, what that means, it doesn't have anything to do with atomic weapons. It has to do with focusing on a central thing and then revolving around that. So with the nuclear family, the central thing is the marriage of the mother and father, and then everything else hypothetically circles around that. That's where the term comes from. For most of the 20th century, the nuclear family was the dominant family type in the United States, as in it was seen as the only good and virtuous family type in the United States. That's very much part of what it meant to be family in the United States during that era. And there were economic reasons for that, there were political reasons for that, there were social reasons for that, all sorts of stuff. However, since the late 1980s, other family types have become more common. There are a variety of reasons for that. Some of them include economic reasons, some of them include political reasons. I'll touch in on a little bit of that more later in this lecture. The biggest reason for what could be called, it's not really an accurate term, the decline of the nuclear family in dominance is the fact that divorce is easier to attain now than it was in previous generations. Like I said, I'll talk about that a little bit. However, with that said, nuclear families are still the majority of families in the United States. Sometimes when political discussions about the family come up, politicians will sometimes say things like, well, what about the family? The family is disintegrating, the family is going away, whatever. Nuclear families are never going away in the United States in the foreseeable future, given what we have in society today. But nuclear families are not the only way to have a family anymore, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that there? A whole lot of people still choose to have 2 parents and kids, basically, is the gist of that. And I hear my nuclear family making noise upstairs. Now, this is an interesting question, though, and I've actually posed this to friends of mine who are specifically scholars on the family, and there is no super clear answer to this yet. And it might be that we're still changing as a society in terms of that. Am I connected okay?
You're doing a lot of breaking up.
I am. Okay, give me a second, guys. I am going to see if I can connect a smidge. We'll see. Just give me, I might leave for a second, just see what happens. Okay, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, it might be a little choppier now. I just switched over to a different router, and it should hypothetically make things better. My signal is much stronger now. Okay, so anyway, the big question among scholars of the family is, are same-sex married couples the same thing in terms of what we observe? Are they the same scientifically as opposite sex couples or as gender fluid couples, gender non-conforming couples, whatever? Is there variation between those different groups in terms of 2 parents with and both of those parents are raising those kids as their own? That is a really super duper interesting question to scholars of the family right now. And the simple answer to it right now is we don't know, namely because in terms of social dynamics, 2013 is still very close to us, 2013 being when same-sex couples got full or mostly full marriage equality. We're just not entirely sure the difference there. The big question there is, is the difference of put in a different way, the discrimination that is seen by same-sex couples, is that discrimination heavy enough so as to change the actual behavior of the family unit itself? It's a very, very interesting question. So if you were looking to go into studying this sort of thing, that is definitely an area where you could publish at least a few papers. Let's get my PowerPoint to cooperate. Okay, now let's talk about some traditional marriage structures. And going into this in a couple slides, we are going to try to shift over to a relatively brief TED Talk. It's only 5 minutes, so even if it fails catastrophically, it's no big deal. So, traditional marriage and traditional marriage structures. This was a buzzword that was heavily politicized by people who opposed same-sex marriage in the early 2000s. And we saw this in the 90s and 2000s especially. It's gone away some since, again, the 2013 marriage equality ruling by the Supreme Court. But what exactly traditional marriage is not as clear-cut as the person that put together this image would tend us to believe. You'll also notice with this image that both of these people are lily white and the same skin tone, probably because the person doesn't have very progressive racial politics either. So, concepts of tradition, regardless of marriage or whatever, are really weird. What exactly tradition is. And you can explore that just by talking to your grandparents as to like what the traditions they did when they were little kids. And they're probably different, right? And these things you think was the most traditional thing ever really aren't that traditional. Most of our traditional Christmas foods, for example, Christmas and Thanksgiving foods. Again, if you're a white person like me in the United States, most of those foods can be traced back to like the 1950s, right? Like that's maybe 2 generations away. Tradition usually isn't that old, is the gist of it. So when people get hung up on concepts of traditional marriage, there's a lot of tradition that you're not including here. And this brief little TED Talk does a pretty good job of describing that. And I'm almost positive this isn't going to work, but I'm going to click on it anyway. And if it doesn't work, I'll just have to pull it up on YouTube conventionally. And yep, nothing. Okay, give me a second, because I do want you to see this. Okay. Here we are. Okay, I got the TED Talk, and now here, come back to you, the new share. Okay, and if by chance the sound doesn't work or everything's all messed up, this only lasts 4 minutes and 43 seconds. So please don't log out because of any sort of nonsense like that. Do you see the TED Talk screen?
Yeah.
Great, fantastic. Okay. Here we go.
There have been many different things written and said about marriage, from the sweetly inspirational to the hilariously cynical. But what many of them have in common is that they sound like they express a universal and timeless truth, when in fact, nearly everything about marriage, from its main purpose to the kinds of relationships it covers, to the rights and responsibilities involved, has varied greatly between different eras, cultures, and social classes. So let's take a quick look at the evolution of marriage. Pair bonding and raising children is as old as humanity itself. With the rise of sedentary agricultural societies about 10,000 years ago, marriage was also a way of securing rights to land and property by designating children born under certain circumstances as rightful heirs. As these societies became larger and more complex, marriage became not just a matter between individuals and families, but also an official institution governed by religious and civil authorities. And it was already well established by 2100 BC, when the earliest surviving written laws in the Mesopotamian Code of Ur-Nammu provided many specifics governing marriage, from punishments for adultery to the legal status of children born to slaves. Many ancient civilizations allowed some form of multiple simultaneous marriage, and even today, less than a quarter of the world's hundreds of different cultures prohibit it. But just because something was allowed doesn't mean it was always possible. Demographic realities, as well as the link between marriage and wealth, meant that even though rulers and elites in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Israel had multiple concubines or wives, most commoners could only afford one or two, tending towards monogamy in practice. In other places, the tables were turned, and a woman could have multiple husbands, as in the Himalayan mountains, where all brothers in a family marrying the same woman kept the small amount of fertile land from being constantly divided into new households. Marriages could vary not only in the number of people they involved, but the types of people as well. Although the names and laws for such arrangements may have differed, publicly recognized same-sex unions have popped up in various civilizations throughout history. Mesopotamian prayers included blessings for such couples, while Native American two-spirit individuals had relationships with both sexes. The first instances of such arrangements actually being called marriage come from Rome, where the emperors Nero and Elagabalus both married men in public ceremonies, with the practice being explicitly banned in 342 AD. But similar traditions survived well into the Christian era, such as adelphopoiesis or brother-making in Orthodox churches, and even an actual marriage between two men recorded in 1061 at a small chapel in Spain. Nor was marriage even necessarily between two living people. Ghost marriages, where either the bride or groom were deceased, were conducted in China to continue family lineages or appease restless spirits, and some tribes in Sudan maintained similar practices. Despite all these differences, a lot of marriages throughout history did have one thing in common. With crucial matters like property and reproduction at stake, they were way too important to depend on young love. Especially among the upper classes, matches were often made by families or rulers. But even for commoners who had some degree of choice, the main concern was practicality. The modern idea of marriage as being mainly about love and companionship only emerged in the last couple of centuries. With industrialization, urbanization, and the growth of the middle class, more people became independent from large extended families and were able to support a new household on their own. Encouraged by new ideas from the Enlightenment, people began to focus on individual happiness and pursuits, rather than familial duty or wealth and status, at least some of the time. And this focus on individual happiness soon led to other transformations, such as easing restrictions on divorce and more people marrying at a later age. So as we continue to debate the role and definition of marriage in the modern world, it might help to keep in mind that marriage has always been shaped by society, and as a society's structure, values, and goals change over time, its ideas of marriage will continue to change along with them.
cool. Yeah, I think that's a good little, okay, anyway. So I guess I have to ask the question, did that work? Did you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, honestly, that like 5-minute TED Talk does a good chunk of this actual lecture, but I am going to go back actually to the lecture because I need to give detail and nuance to things. So here's that. So as it mentioned, there are many what exactly tradition is with marriage. That is something that is highly variable from society to society. And the concept of love in marriage, as that is something that the marriage should be based and focused on, is actually a pretty new idea, even globally. Now, historically, it was thought that you should love your spouse, right? And that's always been kind of seen as important, but basing the marriage itself on love, so that being the reason two people get married, is a relatively new concept. That came into Western society in the early Victorian era, so about the mid 1800s or so. So if your family was in Western society in the 1800s or so, think your maybe great grandparents. Those were the people. So about the time of the Civil War or so. Additionally, many of these practices continue to influence our society today. The concept of the father of the bride giving away the bride at the actual marriage ceremony, that also is based on concepts of property and concepts of men owning women, including their children. And those ideas sound intensely obsolete. They are real and they exist, and some people still have them, which is, again, sounds kind of wild. We're back on the presentation, right?
Yes.
Thank you. So practices related to historic marriage economics include things like arranged marriage. Arranged marriage is the process through which senior family members exercise a control over the choice of their children's spouses. Now, arranged marriage effectively is a piece of culture that goes back to pre-industrial eras when marriage really was very much about economics, very much about businesses or farms or towns or villages, whatever, making arrangements, right? And not necessarily, and then those people would often meet before the marriage, but sometimes they would meet on their wedding day, right? And that, in most circumstances, was seen as a very good thing. It didn't become vilified until our modern era when we start saying, well, marriage should be something else. So you don't really see books railing against arranged marriages in the 16 and 1700s, namely because arranged marriages still happened in the Western world at that time. Now, India is one of the places in the world and other parts of Southwest Asia, arranged marriages still do happen, and they happen with normalcy. It's very much still a thing. Potential, well, I'm skipping around on this slide. Matchmakers are often part of the actual marriage process. Either an individual could do it, so it could be an individual almost acting like a small business, right? And the matchmaker is paid a certain amount of money for successful matches. Or it could be, in the modern world, some sort of Match.com/Tinder-esque experience, right? There is sociologically not so much difference between those online services and the old woman in the village putting people together. There's not so much difference there, which really is interesting in terms of putting things into perspective. Now, oftentimes, if you are in a part of the world where a very traditional matchmaking, arranged marriage stuff kind of happens, it is also then not uncommon for potential brides or grooms, if they are full adults, to do the matchmaking themselves, to actually, and again, as with all things in the scope of human behavior, there are variations and permutations. So one of the more modern, nuanced ways of doing this in a place like India or other parts of the world is to, we see down here, act as your own matchmaker. So, and that can very much look like on a first date, sitting down and meeting someone, and as if not necessarily the first order of business, then something very important is sitting down and talking about, well, how important is marriage? How are we going to get married? Are we going to get married? How many children do you want? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the big variation between East and West there is that in more traditionally American blind dates, if you will, that whole marriage thing is not something that's discussed for quite some time into the relationship, while in a more Eastern kind of perspective, it is something that could be something that's discussed right off the top of the bat. I actually have a good friend that did something similar to basically setting up his own match on a date. They both come from, well, anyway, I'm not going to tell you all about my friends' lives. Yeah, that's it for this slide. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of these economic practices based on ancient traditions and necessities. So bride service was, and in some parts of the world still is, a cultural rule that a man must work for his bride's family for a variable length of time, either before or after the marriage. Effectively, it really highlights the economic aspects of this process here. It varies in degrees of formality. It could be something very much like, okay, well, if you want to be my apprentice, you have to marry my daughter, right? Or it could be, well, you know, we want you to be part of the family business, and part of the family business is this and that and this and that, right? And it's just varying degrees there. I put this here. It's a good way to get a new farmhand. And in some ways, that, again, in some agricultural parts of the world, it still exists to this day. Now, this concept here of levirate, I think that's how you say that. It's not a sociological term, it's an anthropological term. This isn't that. Bride service and levirate are not, they're not the same term. I presume it's said levirate because it goes back to the Levites in the Old Testament, I presume, or Leviticus, something along those lines. It's a custom whereby a man marries the widow of his dead brother. This is a concept that originated among ancient Hebrews, and by virtue of that, since both Islam and Christianity are based in the knowledge of the ancient Hebrews, this concept bled over into some other societies. It's a pretty interesting concept. Effectively, the concept there being that if a woman's husband dies, and remember, these are societies in which women are entirely dependent on their husbands, then the children of those husbands would be, the children would be taken care of, and the women would be taken care of as well. So it's effectively a type of insurance, if you will. Yeah, but these are other concepts associated with marriage. Bride wealth and dowries are a concept that, again, isn't really present in our society, but are present in many societies. Bride wealth are the goods presented by the groom's kin, so the groom's family, to the bride's kin to legitimize a marriage, i.e. The bride price. And I'll talk about what this looks like in the modern era, because there are still some people, even in the United States, that still maintain these traditions. But that's bride wealth. So dowry then is the presentation of goods by the bride's kin to the family of the groom or to the couple/groom. So what's the difference here? Well, with bride wealth, and I'm putting this in really stark terms, and it's not exactly how the people would see it. Bride wealth, effectively, they are paying the groom's family to take the bride, right? And then in dowry, it is the, I'm sorry, I got this mixed up. I'm tired. Present the groom's kin to the bride's kin. So the groom's family is paying the bride's family, to pay for the bride. And then this is the bride's family pay the groom's family to help pay the expenses of the bride, right? Now, these are interesting because especially the bride wealth concept still is done by some people in the United States, namely Polish Americans, some people of Russian descent. This is what's called a bridal chest, and it's a very traditional piece of furniture. And the concept being that this bridal chest is filled with valuable things over the course of a young girl's life. And when she gets married, then it's full of like bed sheets and things that would be needed for the new household, right? And then this is given to the bride and groom for their new household. So that's just one example of that there. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's what that is. So, as mentioned previously, preventing incest, it feels like this presentation can't stop talking about incest. But incest is a really important part of the structural reasons for marriage in traditional societies. So some societies do have even more complex structures to prevent incest, because having children is super duper important in pre-industrial societies, because children are potential workers, right? So exogamy is a term that refers to a set of rules that a person must marry outside of their particular group after to make the wedding happen. So you can't marry anyone from your village, right? You have to marry someone from outside of the village. And exogamy is most typical in super small communities. As I mentioned last week, the Amish, you also see this in tribal communities. They practice exogamy to prevent that kind of very dangerous inbreeding. And then endogamy is a rule that prescribes that a person must marry within their particular group, right? So endogamy requires the person to marry someone similar to them. An example is in traditional Judaism, traditional Catholicism, a Jewish person under those rules are expected to marry another Jew. A Catholic is expected to marry another Catholic. Now, some of those religions, especially in the modern era, do allow for converts, people to convert into the religion. The only real strict rules against that I can immediately think of are Zoroastrians in India are actually forbidden from doing that, but that's a very detailed thing. But yeah, that's what those look like. Now, I want to note, though, that if you have taken an intro to social class or another class, endogamy and exogamy means something different in sociology as opposed to in anthropology itself. In anthropology, endogamy and exogamy talk about where you're going to live. In sociology, endogamy means choosing a mate that is similar to you in some way. So we talk about it, and it usually has to do with the types of studies that you're doing. So if you're talking about mixed race couples and you want to compare mixed race couples to not mixed race couples, you'll talk about endogamy and exogamy in that way. So I am married to another white person, so in that way I have an endogamous relationship. If I would be married to a Black person, I would have an exogamous relationship. For the purpose of testing in this course, because your textbook is an anthropology textbook, we're going to stick with the anthropology definitions of these terms, and I'm not going to get silly and confusing as far as like wording trying to trip you up there. This is actually a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Loving, as in Loving versus the state of Virginia. This was the Supreme Court case that ruled that anti-miscegenation laws, so laws that prevented Black people and white people from getting married in the United States, that those were against, they were unconstitutional. So here are some more definitions. Matrilocal residence. This is a system under which a husband lives with his wife's family after marriage, right? And you can see how this interplays with concepts of endogamy and where you live and all that. Patrilocal residence then is a system under which a bride lives with her husband's family after marriage. Now, what we do in the United States, we typically tend to do neolocal residence. Is a system under which a couple establishes an independent household after marriage. You're not living with your parents, you're going out and doing your thing after that. And this is the most typical form of living after marriage that is done. You'll note this Latin root word neo means new, right? That probably refers to living in a new place altogether. I'm not super sure with how the word came about. It was probably made up by an anthropologist. It could also do with this new way of doing things, because living in a completely new household is a relatively new concept in terms of societies. It used to be you were living with either your family or your spouse's family. Polygamy. So I get, most of us know what polygamy is. It is having multiple spouses, but this is the base definition. The next couple slides are going to be talking about the many, many different kinds of polygamy. And this was alluded to a little bit in the TED Talk. So many marriage structures related to polygamy are more common in pre-industrial societies. And you can see the logic for that. That it would make more sense to have more people in your family unit if you are doing something like running a farm, for example. Polygyny is the word for having multiple wives. So some traditions of polygyny may be, so that's what that is. I had a anthropologist friend put the mnemonic device in my head. Well, how do you say that thing? Do you say polygyny? No, you don't say that. You say polygyny, multiple Jennies, right? So imagine being married to multiple women named Jenny. That's how you say it. So some traditions of polygyny, which is the most common form of polygamy, is potentially based in historic moments of male die-off. So there have been moments in world history when there was a tremendous die-off of men, and usually that is tied in with wars almost typically. Civil wars, civil strife, these are moments when a lot of guys can die off. Well, if you are living in an agricultural society that children are super important and the ability of the family to make more children is also part of the society surviving, then you may see some social change that could permit for one man to have multiple wives for the purposes of repopulating, right? Now, that then becomes part of tradition. Because like I said, tradition can be a pretty new thing, and it only takes 1 or 2 generations for people to think, well, this is how it's always been. So we're a society that has multiple wives. Sororal polygyny then it's a different thing. Sororal polygyny is a form of polygyny in which a man marries multiple sisters, right? So you're marrying this lady, and you're also marrying her sister and maybe another sister. This is a complex relationship between spouses as well as wives. This concept of sororal polygyny, so sorority, right, sisterhood, so sister polygyny, is not to be confused with the fundamentalist FLDS, fundamentalist Mormon concept of sister wives. That's a different idea. This is where one man is marrying multiple sisters, literal sisters from the same parents. I could easily talk for a while about how the mainline Mormon church does not think polygamy is okay. That's absolutely true. FLDS, the fundamentalist Mormons, who are a very fringe group, but sociologically very interesting. They do sometimes illegally have multiple wives. But I decided when I was putting together this presentation, I wouldn't go too much into that because it would really derail us. Anyway, so polyandry, having multiple husbands. There have been societies where women have had multiple husbands. This is dramatically less common because, unfortunately, as a species, we tend to be sexist against women, right? We are very rarely sexist against men. Again, we have the similar concept of fraternal polyandry, very similar to sororal polygyny, where it's a form of polyandry where a man, oops, this would be very progressive, fraternal polyandry. That should say where a woman marries multiple brothers. I mean, I suppose it could happen the other way. The most common and most well-documented area of the world where fraternal polyandry has occurred has been the Himalayas and Tibet, as was mentioned in the TED Talk. And this is a picture of a plot of land that is broken up into individual little crops. This is not actually a picture from Tibet, but it does the job. So there is a particular issue in Tibetan society in which if a father owns land, he owns a farm or his estate or whatever, but let's say he's a farmer, he must divide up that land into equal portions among all of his sons, right? And that's built into the code and the society. Well, that becomes a problem if you're a farmer, because you need a certain amount of land to be able to survive as a farmer. So if your father was a poor farmer, you become his children then become absolutely destitute farmers and can't really even become farmers. So what happens happened in traditional Tibet is that one woman would marry like 12 guys, hypothetically, and get this plot of land right here. And maybe this plot of land is big enough to support all of them, as opposed to just this little plot of land for those children. That also additionally then would have the result of minimizing and limiting the number of children that family could have then too, because one woman can only have so many children, which has, if you do the genealogy of it, the Tibetan system has a certain ebb and flow to it, where it has a certain population control angle to it there too, which is also creepy to think about in terms of people. You get into eugenics territory pretty quickly there. But let's talk about some problems that families often have. As I mentioned in last week's lecture, if you are in an abusive relationship, if you want to talk about a past abusive relationship, there are resources available to Otterbein students. I have a number there that has licensed counselors. There's also a number there that you could talk to another student about things if that is something that's more desirable to you. We're going to be talking about some rough stuff here in the next couple slides. So domestic abuse. As mentioned last week, domestic abuse does include the elderly and children, but usually when we talk about domestic abuse, we're talking about spousal abuse. That's kind of usually what we're talking about. And usually when people are abusive of children and they're abusive of the elderly, they are also abusive of their spouses as well. A family is a system, it's a family. Abuse is present. There's some real nuance here, so be sure to listen with your thinking brain. Abuse is present in all walks of life. So demographically, all racial groups, all religious groups, all sexuality groups, all social classes have some form of abuse that takes place, and that's a bummer. It's a huge bummer. So that's the first piece to keep in mind. Anyone can be a victim of domestic abuse in terms of demographics. That's part one. Now, part two here, I'm going to make this point and then come back to this point. Part two, though, is while it is across demographics, there are some people that are dramatically more prone to be abusers than others. Your risk factors for becoming an abuser are being in a marriage at a relatively young age. Typically under the age of 25 is being at risk of, it's a risk factor. It doesn't mean you be an abuser, it's a risk factor. Typically, the people under the age of 25 lack relationship experience and knowing how to deal with stuff. I look at this because I was married when I was 22, so I buy that. Lack of experience. Emotional maturity as well. This is a brain chemistry element. And I'm pretty sure most of you are under 25, your frontal cortex is not fully developed yet. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It means that there is a certain emotional processing and development that does actually come with age. That's not just dumb folk knowledge. You will be less willing to say, drink a whole bunch and say, screw it, I'll be hungover in the morning. That will be a whole less appealing to you when you get older. And part of that is how your brain will work. Emotion, yeah, as I mentioned. Additionally, so that's being young, being male. That we do have problems with toxic masculinity in our society. I'll talk about that stuff more next week, actually. Men tend to do things that could damage us or other people more than women or other people would. Additionally, with cultures of abuse and violence, it's often thought that it's okay for a man to be violent, but not for a woman to be violent. And then additionally, and this is a big one, a lack of social support and safety nets. So if the couple is, or the family is socially isolated, then that puts them at greater risk for domestic abuse. So each of these on their own isn't that dangerous. But that's my, again, oh my God, my mom just, where? What was I thinking? Okay, anyway though, so young people, males under the age, and socially isolated, that's where domestic abuse is most likely to occur. And then what immediately comes to my mind when I look at this slide is that there is probably a very dangerous amount of domestic abuse happening right now because of the isolation of COVID. This is an area that is really kind of troubling. So if you want to donate to something right now, donate some money to people who help the victims of domestic abuse, because I'm sure it's probably not good right now. Now, in terms of domestic abuse, there are 4 stages of an abusive spousal relationship. In stage 1, the relationship appears to be normal. Even the worst of domestic abuse relationships look normal part of the time, particularly to outsiders. You don't know what other people's relationships are like behind closed doors. That's a really important thing to remember. Stage 2, the victim could feel like they're, quote, walking on eggshells to avoid arguments. So you're just trying your best not to make the other person angry. Now, an important thing to remember here, though, is that all relationships, especially long-term relationships, they fluctuate between stage 1 and stage 2. That's a super common thing. There are some times when I make my wife really angry and I try to stay away from her to keep her from getting angry. But where it changes to an abusive relationship is when it moves into stage 3, where acute battering, so intense battering and violence can occur. It can last for seconds. It could be one hit, it could be hours, it could hypothetically be days. And a key part of that there, and part of the abusive mindset, is that the abuser blames the victim for the abuse itself. So it's something like, why do you make me do this? I wouldn't hit you if you didn't behave this way, something like that. That's a really key part of the domestic abuse thing. Stage 4 then is, will occur, the abuser will apologize profusely and promise that it will never happen again. It'll sound something like, oh, you know, I love you, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, this will never happen again, blah, 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 blah. That is a really key part to the psyche of abuse there too. So just because someone's apologized for something doesn't mean, and especially physical abuse, doesn't mean that it won't happen again. Sadly, the sociological literature, the social work literature, the psychology literature all show us that abusive relationships don't just go away. Once it's actually become a full-blown abusive a spouse hitting another spouse, that doesn't end until the relationship ends. Hopefully that means one person, the victim, leaving the abuser, but it could also mean the abuser actually killing the abused person. So if you're in an abusive relationship, please try to get out of it. Yeah, it's real super sad stuff. Now, divorce. Just like marriage, traditional ideas surrounding divorce are actually quite varied. Traditionally in the United States, prior to, say, the 60s or so, there was a real heavy social stigma on divorce. However, our attitudes toward divorce have changed really significantly over the last 50 years. While many societies have not traditionally allowed divorce, some have been more permissive. So there have been societies that have been far more permissive than traditional American societies, where a woman or a man could simply ask the other spouse to end the relationship, right? It's like, I'm not happy, this isn't working, we're done, we're through. Which in some societies, that's how it actually was. In other societies, however, especially if you're in a bad relationship, it makes you think, well, did women in this society actually have the ability to get away from their spouses, right? If you're in a heavily patriarchal society, is it as easy of just saying, hey, I want a divorce, right? Well, if you're being abused, that could just be a really bad, that could be your death, right? So there's a lot of variations here in this social dynamic. Now here is a very interesting piece, and this chart tells us so much about how divorce has changed in the United States between the mid-1850s and the more modern day. This number conks out at 2010, because that was the last time the census was taken. And we'll see what this year's census has in terms of demographics. Anyway, though, you will note a relatively steady increase in divorce in the United States until about the 1940s. And then we see this big spike that happens in the 40s and early 50s. Now, can anyone have any guesses as to what caused that massive spike in divorce in that era?
Maybe war.
Yeah, how?
When husbands go away, maybe wives tended to cheat or something in that sense.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. And there is still a little bit of tradition of this in the armed forces, a smidge, at least among people I've known. And this was a real big part of the culture of World War II, was this concept of having someone to go home to. It was thought of being bad luck to go off to war and be single, because if you just went off without someone to write home to, then it was thought that you'd just die, right? You'd have nothing to fight for, right? And that was a big part of the culture then. Well, a lot of guys, because it's a military of all men during this era, they would get married to women maybe they didn't know all that well, or they weren't really all that well suited for. So then you have a bunch of people getting married really quick. Guy goes off to war. He comes back maybe 4 years later. 4 years is a really, really long time for people in their early 20s. And then you throw war into that, the PTSD associated with that, and how people change over the time. And then maybe she cheats on him, maybe he cheats on her. A lot of things happen during that period. And as a result of that, a whole lot of people got divorced in the early 50s, which is not a time when we thought that people got divorced a whole lot. And then you see this big uptick in divorce happen in 1970. And you see this uptick from 1970 to about 1990. And this is a super interesting thing to me because I was born in 1983 and I was a kid in the 90s. I was consuming media in the 90s. And it's so interesting to look back at those movies and that kids' media because this massive upswing was caused by changes in divorce laws. This thing called no-fault divorce came into play in the 1970s and 80s, where state laws were changing, meaning that you didn't have to have a legal reason to get a divorce. You could just get divorced because you hate the bastard, right? Well, that didn't exist prior to this era. So there was probably a massive store or backlog of people that should have been divorced for a long time and weren't getting divorced. And if they would have been allowed to divorce, this would have been a more steady kind of curve, right? But there were all these people that could suddenly get divorced and they were getting divorced. But if you're a kid, like I was in 1992, it looked like and it felt like everyone's family was absolutely going to get divorced, like always. And you really see that in the kids' media of that era. There are very few actual nuclear families during in like the Disney movies of set in the early 90s because of people perceiving that. Now that also plays into politics to a degree because there are some people to this day even that make the argument, oh, marriage never works, marriage falls apart, marriages always go away. And that kind of thinking is set in this trend, but it's not based on science. You will see clearly that starting about 1990, the rate goes back down again, right? So we will never be back down at these rates of these low divorce rates, because this is an era when like you weren't allowed to get divorced, right? Probably what we're seeing here, now if I live to be 120, I will expect this line to kind of even out. I think we are, from what I've seen, at about like the normal divorce rate right now, which is somewhere between 40, if I remember correctly, 40 and 55% of first marriages end in divorce. Now that's a really interesting point. You have to emphasize first marriages ending in divorce, because if you look at second marriages and third marriages, then those marriages tend to be much more successful. And I'll talk about that in a minute or two. Any questions there? No? Okay. This is just a super interesting slide. I think the really stark thing is that people thought that marriage was just going to explode. And there's some people that think that, but honestly, the institution of marriage is alive and well in our society. So let's talk about some change in terms of marriage. So serial monogamy, this is a new thing in our society. And this does have to do with me talking about second and third marriages. So second and third marriages are much more likely to last than first marriages are. There are a number of reasons for that. For many people who get divorced, it's a very hard thing, but it is a learning process for many people as far as what they want in a relationship and what kind of relationship works for them. So people who get divorced and then go on to get married a second or maybe third time don't make the mistakes they made in their first marriage. So they know to avoid certain types of people, or they don't want to be in certain types of relationships, or they learn about themselves that they're the kind of person that doesn't want to be married at all in the first place. Many people do that as well. And for these reasons, you see second marriages and third marriages stay together at a much higher frequency than first marriages do. Now, this concept of partners is a very interesting one. Prior to marriage equality in 2013, couples were increasingly calling themselves partners instead of getting married. I left a big thing out there. This should say heterosexual couples or male-female couples, right? There was a distinct tendency among heterosexual couples, or again, male-female couples, saying, we're not going to get married until everyone can get married. That was a very cliche, progressive statement many people made during this era. And there are a bunch of reasons why people would say that. So there are a bunch of straight people calling them partners. Now, I don't know what is going to happen to this term partners. I'm really not quite sure. It's an interesting thing we could talk about if we were in person. But it was a thing. Now that more same-sex couples are calling themselves, and they are married, they're calling them their wives or their husbands or whatever, it's interesting linguistically. There are many things in our society I find very interesting in terms of the social change. And the beautiful thing about social change is we don't exactly know what is going to happen. And I think that's super duper interesting. Typically, partners are cohabitating, obviously. The definition there being living in the same dwelling as romantic partners. They live as their partner, right? Cohabitating may serve for some people as a transition state to formal marriage. So there are some romantic partners that are cohabitating that are planning on getting married eventually. There are other couples and partners that don't want anything to do with the institution of marriage at all, and they're never going to get married. Either of those people, though, in either situation, that's still called cohabitating, is that term there. The term is not typically cohabitating. The term is cohabitating, by the way. It's slightly confusing. Polyamory. Polyamory is a type of romantic relationship between more than two people. This, in terms of social change, is a very, very new thing. Now, given there have been polyamorous relationships for a very, very long time, but it is becoming more socially acceptable, especially among young people. The key to polyamorous relationships within the polyamory subculture is that all people involved in the polyamorous relationship are consenting. And when we say that, it not only means the people who are having sexual relationships, but also the other sexual partners of the people in the sexual relationships, right? A man who is in a polyamorous relationship cannot have another partner who is not okay with the polyamorous relationship. That's not polyamory, that's cheating. And that's a very important distinction there, is the absolute consent of the relationships. A term that is often used is polycule. That, again, is a super new term. We'll see if that actually stays around. That is the term often used by some polyamorous relationship people for the social network of the relationship. So if all of these people, whether this guy is having sex with this lady or not, would be the polycule, however that would actually go down. I always wonder about stock image photos of people if they, I Google search polyamory, and this picture of this group of people came up. LGBTQ families. This is another area where social family structures are changing. While LGBTQ people have had families for very long times, LGBTQ families are becoming more visible and accepted in our society. I've mentioned it a bunch of times. The 2013 Supreme Court ruling on marriage equality was a major factor in creating social acceptance among same-sex couples. It may be because the case is a real mouthful that we don't refer to specifically as that case as we do. Normally, when scholars are talking about, they just say marriage equality, but the Supreme Court case was Obergefell v. Hodges. Those were the two parties involved in the case itself that went to the Supreme Court. Prior to 2013, much debate around same-sex couples and same-sex marriage focused on civil unions as a potential alternative for same-sex marriage. We talked so much about that during that era in terms of, well, what does marriage look like for people, for non-heterosexuals or non-men and women in marriages, right? And when I say those, there's just so many different permutations, right? You can have a heterosexual man in a marriage with a bisexual woman. So you can't call it heterosexual marriage. That's not a heterosexual marriage. That's why we use those terms same sex and opposite sex. However, though, the reason why this concept of the civil union has gone away largely is because they were not consistent. What a civil unionship looked like in California was very different than what a civil unionship looked like in the state of Vermont, looked different than what it could do for you in a hospital versus what it could do for you as part of the military. So those inconsistencies and those differences are what eventually led to that Supreme Court ruling, very much based on the concept that we saw in Brown versus the Board of Education, where separate is not equal, right? Where different institutions for different people, types of people, means that discrimination will just continue. That's where a lot of that thought and concept is with that particular Supreme Court ruling. And then finally, blended families. Blended families are maybe the family type other than nuclear families that most of us are familiar with. This is a family made up of two or more formerly independent households. So what we're talking about there is we're talking typically about one person who's been divorced marrying someone else who has been divorced, and then those people have children from previous families, and then this forms a new blended family. I believe the textbook calls this a compound family. It's the same concept. In the 1990s, as I mentioned, there was a lot of thought because this was a very new thing. Well, what's going to happen to these kids? Are they going to have really deep-seated emotional problems? Are they going to have psychological problems when they grow up? We really didn't know at that time. Subsequently, though, we have found in psychological and sociological research that actually the children of blended families have a greater capacity for social flexibility. So they are better capable of adapting to very new social relationships or social settings, as opposed to people like me, whose my birth parents are still married. whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they're still married. I don't have that degree of flexibility than say my cousins do, whose parents got divorced when they were little. And you can see that it's a really super interesting thing. Okay, well, that is the end of this lecture. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So I don't know if this is ever going to be a question that comes up on like a quiz or something like that, but the Oberfeld versus Hodges, the 2013 date, is that like referring to the beginning of the case itself, or like the actual ruling? Because I thought that it was 2015.
When did you think it was?
The actual Supreme Court ruling was 2015.
2014? 2015?
Yeah.
You're probably right. It's really super duper hard unless you have a legal textbook in front of you or you remember the year specifically. I think you're probably right. I think it is probably 2015. Yeah, you're probably right. It's hard to figure that out actually. If you Google search that, it's difficult right now because so many people are talking about what a different composition of the Supreme Court will mean for marriage equality, because a lot of people are super concerned. Fortunately, almost all legal scholars, because I went down that rabbit hole on the internet, almost all legal scholars agree that same-sex marriage and marriage equality is staying in the United States. So we don't have that to worry about. But yeah, good job, Corey, on calling me out on that, because I honestly was having a hard time nailing down that year. Yeah, so for the record, it's 2015. I think you're right. Anything else? Okay. Sure, Andy.
Can you go over the assignments for this week?
Yeah, sure, I can go over them. 1 second. Just give me a second. Now you guys can look over your own. Yeah, the Brady Bunch, Jason, is a real classic example of a blended family, actually. Let me pull that up. The assignments for the week. Okay. Oh, I see what you guys are asking. I am realizing it as I'm looking at this that I haven't put together the quiz for this week yet. So I will get that up easily in the next, before 9 o'clock, I'll get that up. But you do have a quiz there, and let me just double check that. But when I click on that, it'll come up that there is no quiz there. Yeah, there's an error that comes up. That's because there's no questions on it because I haven't written it yet. So don't worry about that. That will be up by tomorrow morning for you to take that quiz on chapter 10. And then your short essay, Why the Rush? I'll just read this. The assignment was modified from the Cultural Anthropology Journal, and your essay prompt is think about your marriage, current relationships, or past or future partners. Were there any expectations that you would date a member of a particular group or of which you are a member? Did the expectations come from you or your family? Do you think differently about this than your parents? So what I'm looking for there is for you to talk about relationships or expectations of you in society to have a relationship with someone who is similar to yourself. Have you ever, I'm just making up hypotheticals. If you are a person who has suffered some sort of judgment from your parents, hypothetically, because you're dating someone of a different racial group or religious group or whatever, or would you think your parents would expect you to have a relationship with? That's what we're looking at with that there. Yeah, I'm just looking for you to dig a little bit into those concepts. Does that make sense?
So it's not so much about a past relationship or a current relationship, so much as relationship expectations.
Yeah, that's safe. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Anyone else? Yeah, good. My windows have just done a weird thing, so it's making it even more difficult and strange to talk to you than usual. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, that's what we're gonna do. I will put together that quiz for you pretty quickly, and I will get this recording up hopefully this evening too. It just takes a while to load things up on YouTube if you want to look at this for reference purposes. But if there are no further questions, I'm going to end this thing. There is no culture of the week this week on account of I'm planning on putting this week into the same week as last week in coming semesters. We good to go? Okay. As a few people are already logging off, I'm going to call this good. Okay, see you guys before everyone logs off. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.